Thank you. My name is Jan Gaylor, and I am the very proud president here at Scottsdale Community College. On behalf of all of our faculty, our student affairs professionals, and the many people who make this a very special place, welcome to Scottsdale Community College. We are so thrilled to have you here tonight to help us celebrate the Hispanic Heritage Month. It's a privilege for us to be here and to acknowledge the importance of the culture, the history, and all of the many aspects of the Latino and Hispanic populations. We are thrilled that you are here. You may or may not know, I hope those who come to school here probably know this, but for our guests, once you crossed Pima Road, you entered the sovereign nation of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. I hope, if not tonight, very soon, you will find the time to stroll our 160 acres. And if you do, I'm sure you'll recognize how seriously we take our stewardship responsibility, stewardship of the land and the spirit of the people here. So welcome to SCC. You know, we are thrilled to host this event tonight. It is so important. About 3 or 4 years ago, actually it was in 2012, I signed a resolution called Not on Our Campus. It was an affirmation that at SCC we will not tolerate hatred, intolerance, or lack of civility. And yes, absolutely. This is a safe and a welcoming place for all of our students, So tonight, we are going to be treated to a film. We have a relatively new faculty member, Roberto Gudino. Yoo-hoo! I'm told my Spanish sounds more Italian than Spanish, but I give it a try. Roberto is going to share tonight how he used his talent to tell a story about others who told stories and actually won Pulitzer Prize for their storytelling about the situation and the lives of a variety of Latinos way back in 1984. I remember it well. Some of you weren't even around then, in the LA area. So I'm sure that tonight's video or film documentary will move us, it will inform us, and it will probably inspire us. So thank you very much for coming, and now it's my pleasure to hand it over to the maestro. There we go.
Thank you, Dr. Gaylor, for the warm welcome. I'm very excited to be here with you today. Thank you all for coming. I'm very honored and humbled that Scottsdale Community College would choose my documentary film, Below the Fold, to help celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. Special thanks also to the event organizers, Therese Tendrick, as well as Michelle, Jonathan. Thank you for making this so special, especially Leroy, and I know we have Justin up there from IT. He's going to be patching in our Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Some other special thanks as well to Dr. Gaylor, to Dr. Fuji, to Susan Peterson. Who else am I missing? I'm teasing. To, of course, Lucas Messer, as well as Amanda Embry and Bill True. Thank you so much for your support. It means so much. And thank you for spreading the word about the documentary. This documentary was created some 10 years ago with the support of the University of Arizona, the Media Democracy and Policy Initiative. I was actually an undergraduate student, and I approached the Media Democracy and Policy Initiative about an idea to create a documentary about the first Hispanics to win a Pulitzer Prize with the LA Times. And Olga Briceño extended to me that support, a support as a student filmmaker to find the funding, to find equipment, to go out and shoot this film in New York, in LA, in various different locations. So Olga Briceño, thank you so much for making it possible. Also, a quick thank you to my mom. She's somewhere in the audience. I'm not quite sure where she is. She should be over there. She's probably in the lobby grabbing food. But yeah, thanks, Mom, for being here tonight, as well as Yesenia. Thank you for coming all the way from LA. Without further ado, let's watch Below the Fold. There's going to be a Q&A section afterwards, so please stick around for that. Our Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Frank Sotomayor, unfortunately, was unable to be with us tonight, but he did promise to come back at some other point later on, either this semester or next semester. So without further ado, Below the Fold. Thank you.
Wow, what did you guys think about that? Yeah. That was some pretty impressive vision for an undergrad student, Roberto, I gotta say.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sitting through that. My name is Jonathan Higuera. I am a communications coordinator here at the college, and I am also the chair of the Inclusiveness Council of Scottsdale Community College, and I'm also a co-advisor to the Latino Student Association. And it was an honor to see this because I got my start in the newspaper industry in the 80s. So these folks and their Pulitzer Prize were pioneers for those of us trying to make it in that industry then. So thank you for doing that for us and letting us learn about that backstory. So we're going to have a little discussion here, plática, as we might say in Spanish, with the filmmaker. We are also going to have Frank Sotomayor, who you saw there. He will be joining us via a phone call, a landline, so he will also be able to take questions. We want to move quickly through the program. We want to, so you have plenty of time to ask your questions, okay? And we'll have mics set up on each side over here where you can go to, and if you have a question, by all means ask, okay? Don't be shy. All right. There's a few people I have to thank in addition to the ones that Roberto thanked earlier because they've been instrumental in this. And let me go through that first so we can acknowledge them. The Maricopa Center for Learning and Instruction's Office of International and Intercultural Education provided a grant for this event that paid for it in part, and we're very thankful for that. In particular, Catherine Howard from that office was very gracious in providing us a grant to bring this event to you, okay? We also would like to acknowledge my fellow co-advisors from the Latino Student Association. Caprice Bombella, are you here? Please stand as we call your name if you're, and Ramona Santiesteban. The Latino Student Association has been putting on these Hispanic Heritage Month events now for at least the 5 years that I've been with Scottsdale Community College, and I gotta say, this is the best attendance we've had. So thank you for doing that.
Round of applause to you.
I'm not sure if the delegation from the University of Guanajuato is here in the house. They were going to come, led by Jaime Herrera from Mesa Community College. I don't think they're here, but we appreciate the partnership we're developing with them. And of course, no SCC program or event worth filming and broadcasting would happen without the technical expertise of our media service folks. So Justin Johnson, up there, Cameron, part of that crew. They are tremendous, and on short notice, too. They will come through for you. Thank you very much. And for this wonderful facility here, which is under construction for an upcoming performance, you'll have to come back and see that. I think it's called William Shakespeare, Land of the Dead. Zombies, the Apocalypse, and William Shakespeare. I don't know, but they do great productions here, so I got to plug that. But the facility is led by the able Leroy Timblin and his crew. They provide first-rate services and also come through for you in a pinch. He's working with Gabby and Mason tonight, so thank you for your help up there. This is being recorded, and we would like to, hopefully, we'll be able to share this evening with the world, or maybe MCTV will run it on their Cox Channel 115. So, and finally, I would like to thank our student volunteers drawn from the Community College Initiative Program. They are international students who join us every year and do a tremendous amount of work here. They are incredible, so thank you. And just wanted to point out two other people that you've already mentioned, but this event would not happen without the vision of Michelle Du. We screened this film at our Multicultural Film Fest last spring as part of our Inclusiveness Council event, and she's the one who had the vision saying, we need other people to see this. We should make this a Hispanic Heritage Month event. So Michelle, and she's worked tirelessly to make that happen. So thank you, Michelle Du. And finally, Therese Tendick, who, without her attention to detail, I can't tell you where we'd be without her. So thank you, Therese, as well, from the Center for Civic and Global Engagement. With that out of the way, let's get to our questions, okay? Okay, Roberto, the first question I have for you, tell us about Below the Fold. Where does that name come from?
Great question. I wish I would have had a cheat sheet before this. But below the fold comes from, it's a journalism term. So typically anything that is above the fold from your actual newspaper, who remembers those? Actual newspapers you'd get in the morning. So anything that's above that is news that gets, I guess, the best play. So it's your leading headlines. It's going to be above the fold. Anything that's buried, anything that's hidden, any stories that are untold are typically below the fold. So that's, in a sense, how we wanted to honor the journalist and, in a sense, include journalism in the title of the story.
Very apropos. I come out of the newspaper industry, so I knew exactly, but so many people don't have that background. But what was it that compelled you to do this particular story? I'm sure as an undergrad, you probably had a lot of interest. Why did you latch onto this story?
As most of you other filmmakers in the room know, there's 20,000 people with money and scripts ready to hand you for you to go and direct your film. But no, in all honesty, oh good, I got a joke. I got a laugh out of that joke, good. Usually they bomb, ask my students. So I first became interested in journalism and storytelling as a community college student at Cochise Community College. So who knows where Douglas, Arizona is? Yeah. All right, someone from Douglas back there. But yeah, Douglas is a small town. It's a border town along the US-Mexico border, about 4 hours south here of Phoenix. And I first became interested in journalism, and specifically photojournalism. So I started taking first courses, part-time courses, in photography at my local community college. And from there, really was born this love of photography and storytelling, which then turned into a love of motion picture. And that's how I ended up at the University of Arizona. So I ended up getting accepted from Cochise Community College to the University of Arizona for a Bachelor of Fine Arts. And there, I was actually doing my capstone film. So a lot of you filmmakers in the room, which I could see around here, eventually you're gonna be doing your capstone, your thesis, your senior thesis capstone film, and you're gonna be scrambling to figure out what story you're going to tell. Is it going to be a documentary? Is it going to be a fiction film? And there was this love, again, of storytelling, journalism, photography, and I happened to come across this organization within the University of Arizona, which is called the Media Democracy and Policy Initiative. And I know much like the MDPI, there's a lot of other organizations on this campus which are also very supportive of young filmmakers. I think Trinity Carr is a president of two of our at least one of our student film clubs. So if you're interested in a student film club that could potentially support you in your filmmaking, look into that. So in doing that, in speaking with Olga Briceño, she let me know about the Latinos and the Hispanics who won the Pulitzer Prize. And it very much sparked an interest in me to help tell their story, because it was a story that hadn't been told about minorities in media. And I felt, and a lot of people feel like that today, that it's an important story to tell. Not a lot of people in journalism know about this story. Also, it could be very inspiring to the next generation of journalists, of media creators, of filmmakers. Why? Because they see themselves represented on the screen. So she told me about this story. I was going to say long story short, but I think it's already a little long.
Well, what I'm glad you jumped onto it, because I know personally now several of these interviewees that you interviewed are no longer with us, beyond the two that was mentioned there. So I think your interviews now are really valuable as a historical record of what some of these folks went through. I know George Ramos, who was pictured in there, the Vietnam veteran, is no longer with us. I think Robert Montemayor, another one, is no longer with us. So thank you for preserving some of that for the historical record. We appreciate it. I'd like to bring in at this point Frank Sotomayor, who was featured prominently in here. He was an assistant editor. He was one of the leaders of this, and we have him on the phone from his home in Tucson. He's retired now, living in Tucson. And Frank, are you there? Well, hopefully we're going to get Frank back on the line, because he's integral to this story. Frank spent a 40-year career, not only at the Los Angeles Times, but at University of Southern California, as a tireless advocate of diversity in journalism and diversity in newsrooms and why it's important. And I was hoping he'd be able to talk to some more about to us about what impact this may have had, and how does that contrast with what's going on today. But we'll carry on the conversation until we can pick him up on the feed. Okay. So doing this as an undergrad, what seemed to be the biggest challenge to getting it done? Is it finances? Is it the technical skill of filming? What were your biggest challenges in trying to complete this?
Great question. For me, I would say, and I think a lot of other filmmakers in this room can agree, funding. So it could be a challenge to get funding, but I know at least at the University of Arizona, I found a lot of support in terms of scholarships. So look for the scholarship money. So I got a grant to fly me out to New York, and that grant paid for room and board and transportation. That's when I interviewed Robert Montemayor, who at the time was working for the Wall Street Journal. And I also got a second grant from the Hanston Film Institute from the University of Arizona, which paid for my gas to drive from Tucson to San Luis Obispo in California. And I think, but really, I think there's opportunity and challenges. And I think in that, not having the money to fly out there on my own or pay for the gas money, opportunities were found at the University of Arizona through scholarships. And again, I bring it up because I know I've been very student-centric, but here at Scottsdale Community College, as you know, we're very student-centric. We're all about student success. So I want to make sure that the student filmmakers in this room know that there's scholarships, grants, opportunities out there for you to get that money and fly out to places that you need to be. So I think, again, to answer your question, the challenge was initially funding, but that was actually a blessing in disguise, because then that led to other funding and scholarship opportunities.
I was impressed how you let them, in their own voice, in their own words, speak to a lot of the things they faced in trying to get this series done, and how they wove it into their own personal experiences. They took probably some non-traditional journalism routes to tell this story. As an undergrad shooting it, were you aware of that? Were you feeling that? How did you decide to approach the film as you did?
It was one of the best experiences in my life, because finally I could look up to heroes that looked like me. So in the media, not oftentimes would you see Hispanics doing white-collar jobs, being journalists, writing about their stories. When I say their stories, in terms of the population that they represent, like being in East LA, I believe he mentioned south side of Tucson. And what happens oftentimes is that, I believe it was Nancy Rivera Brooks, who still works at the LA Times. By the way, she just won, or she was just inducted into the Hall of Fame in the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Oh. So kudos to Nancy if you're watching on the screen. So I think it really moved me, because I finally saw those heroes that I could look up to, and I thought, you know what, if they could do it, I could do it too. If they were able to win a Pulitzer Prize, maybe something could happen with this documentary. And little did I know, several years later, I'd be screening it as a faculty member at a community college, which is near and dear to my heart. So.
Okay. Were we able to reach Frank? Hello, Frank, are you there? Okay, we'll keep going then. All right. Oh, I think I heard something.
I heard maybe it's GoToMeeting, but.
Frank, are you there?
Or Skype.
Okay. Wow, very interesting. And this just brings back flashbacks for me because as an undergrad at Arizona State at the time, I remember going to a conference in Tucson when the whole buzz of the conference was about this Pulitzer Prize. And it really gave me hope as someone who was starting out in the business that we could tell the story of our own community. That's a big thing. When you're a journalist, many times it feels like the stories are prescribed to you. Editors say yay or nay to your story ideas. And sometimes you feel like your story ideas are getting shot down. And I think this series showed that you could tell the story that you wanted to tell about your community. You could do it successfully, and it could be recognized at the highest levels. The Pulitzer Prize is the highest level in journalism. That said, I detected from some of the comments there that it didn't make their career per se, that some of them still faced resentments or glass ceilings, perhaps. So that kind of speaks to you can win the highest prize in the land for your profession, and it still doesn't mean your career is set. It's not all the way through. What are your thoughts on some of the folks who were a little bit cynical about what it led to for them?
Right, and you alluded to it in terms of, for some it was a boon, and for others it was a bane, which is interesting, to win the Pulitzer Prize, for it to be a negative in your life, because then you have that weight on your shoulder. You're a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and you're going to turn in this 500-word article to us that's not up to snuff. It's not going to be above the fold. It's going to be below the fold. So for some, it was something that they had to wrestle with. For others, it was beneficial. I think, for me, from my perspective, is that there were very much pioneers in not only journalism, but I would say in media or media creation, right? Because I think George would often talk about, because I had a great weekend with George and San Luis Obispo, myself, and Luis Romero Davis, for some of you guys that have taken a class with Luis. We spent a lot of time with George Ramos, and he would tell us about being relegated to what at that time was quote unquote called the taco beat. So the taco beat is when you're relegated to a certain community and you're very much pigeonholed in that way. And I think for George, at least, from what I recall, he very much wanted to be looked at as a journalist that could really report on any story, that it didn't have to be exclusively about one community or the other, that he had a breadth of knowledge that he could really report on any community or any story. But I think, again, since they were pioneers, there were a lot of challenges and a lot of barriers that they were able to tear down for media creators such as myself and other minorities. And I do want to highlight that what attracted me to their story was less so about them being the first Hispanics to win a Pulitzer Prize. It was more so an underdog story. It's an underdog story that it's very relatable. Oh, that might be Frank.
Hello, Frank, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we have you on speakerphone and everybody can hear you, so thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. May I please say how very sorry I am. Apologize to Dr. Geller, to you, Jonathan, Roberto, and everybody in the audience. I am so sorry I cannot attend in person.
No need to apologize.
I've been hit with a very bad case of shingles, which is a very painful illness.
Okay, we'll get right to the questioning with you since we have you on the line.
It's okay, Frank. Hi, Frank. It's Roberto.
So,
hello.
Here's my question for you, Frank. As you look back, and with the benefit of experience that you have now to reflect on, what struck you as the most personally satisfying aspect of being involved in this Pulitzer Prize project?
Okay, let me see. Personally satisfying. Well, first of all, coming up with the story ideas, initiating the whole project, and then working closely with the journalists, my colleagues, all of us Mexican Americans, working on these stories. And then I would say it was satisfying after not succeeding in the first 2 times of finally convincing our editor to nominate our series for a Pulitzer Prize. Well, of course, winning the Pulitzer Prize was a great honor personally, but significantly, our series became a model for other news media outlets on how to report on Latinos and other underserved communities.
I heard you mention before that it was somewhat groundbreaking in terms of being explanatory journalism, that perhaps explanatory journalism wasn't getting acknowledged with the Pulitzer Prize or other journalism prizes as it should have. Did you feel that it helped break some ground in terms of explanatory journalism? And maybe quickly, what is explanatory journalism for some of you who aren't in the journalism field?
Well, yes, it was certainly groundbreaking. And to quote the jurors on the Pulitzer Prize, they called it a landmark piece of journalism, because it was 27 stories in all, published over 3 weeks. And we had in-depth stories. We had stories told accurately, stories told with historical context. We talked with real people, people that were successful, people that were struggling. So it really gave a good portrait of a Latino community of Southern California. And before, the coverage of Latinos was kind of considered as a little bit undervalued. It was sometimes called the taco beat. So our series showed what you could do, and to win the top prize in journalism was a great honor, and also, as I said, a model for other news media.
Now, Frank, I know you've gone back and have since written a book about kind of that sheds the backstory on this, on your story, on this project. And it was illuminating when I read it to see that, you know, the LA Times had a contentious relationship with the Latino community going back decades. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Right. Well, I was very happy to be able to write the story, the backstory. I named it the long shot, the Pulitzer long shot, and it's available online. I wanted it to be easily available to everybody. And in going back through the history, up until 1970, the LA Times had a very contentious relationship, as you say, with the Mexican American and other Latinos in Southern California. The paper was extremely conservative, pro-business, anti-labor, and they often took stands that were against the goals and the aspirations of Mexican Americans. In 1970, a new publisher came in with the idea of making it politically independent and making it one of the great newspapers in the United States. So when I arrived there in 1970, the newspaper was still changing, still evolving, but it was improving in many ways, although the staff was pretty much still white males. That was the status of newspaper staffs throughout the country. So, as I say in the story, Roberto's wonderful film, we finally had enough journalists in 1983 to be able to pull off a story and really show what the community was all about.
Thank you. Wonderful. I want to also ask you a little bit about the film and your book kind of paint a picture of a pervasive newsroom culture that characterized Latinos and perhaps other minorities too as a problem people, not as contributors. And I'm not talking in every instance, but you know, generally speaking. Do you feel that your series impacted that perception and that coverage, really, of Latinos as a problem people?
Yes, I think our series really helped to paint a broader, more accurate picture. Before our series, we complained that the coverage was mainly about gangs, mainly about immigration, illegal immigration, mainly about problems, whereas, like all communities, there were people who were very successful, people that were contributing mightily to the economy. So we did have a few people in the newsroom that gave us very disparaging ethnic comments during the time we were doing that. But luckily, our main editors were very supportive of the series.
Okay. Well, let's get back to you, Roberto, and ask you, this is a 20-minute documentary. And by the way, we're going to have a Q&A starting here shortly. So if you do have questions, be thinking of them. And we're going to have you go to these microphones over here. So please start the wheels turning on the questions you may want to ask, okay? And following this event, we'll have a short meet and greet in the East Lobby over there if you'd like to ask more questions. But this is a 20-minute documentary done in 2007. Any plans to revisit it or expand the story or remaster it? What are your future plans with regards to that?
Thank you. Great question. I do. Since this film was, like you mentioned, made some 10 years ago, I feel the film was also it's evergreen. I think you could screen it 10 years from now, and some of the issues that Frank and the other Hispanic journalists wrote about are still relevant today and may still be relevant 5 or 10 years from now. And also, not only that, but it's still a story that's it's somewhat unknown, especially among mainstream media. I think there's a few journalists that know about it, and I think a lot of those journalists are with the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Even then, it's not a story that's widely known, and it's such a groundbreaking series, the Latino series. I think it's a story that should be shared, and I feel it's a story that, again, it's very relatable, it's very inclusive, and when I say that, I mean that it's an underdog story, that a lot of people can relate to it. You don't have to be Mexican-American, Colombian-American, Hispanic, Latino. You could be from various different backgrounds, African-American, and relate to this underdog story, this struggle that oftentimes is found either in your career or other aspects of life. So, with that said, the goal is to remaster this film. As you saw, it's been a couple of years since we've touched it. It is not HD, as you noticed. Also, I noticed some screen grabs from some websites that look like they're from the 1980s. So I feel that this is a documentary that could be remastered. We got very close to doing a broadcast hour documentary with PBS. So PBS had initially picked this up, and we're going to turn this into a broadcast hour doc. So for you filmmakers, that's a 56-minute documentary for broadcast. And the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was behind it. We had gotten funding from Latino Public Broadcasting, but I had choices to make in my life, and you students will have the same choices to make. I had an embarrassment of riches. I could go to Mexico City on a Fulbright for a year, or I could do the documentary. So I chose the Fulbright. But with that said, I still have the footage. The goal is still to remaster this documentary, to get it out there. My goal is to get it out to as many journalism schools as possible, as many community college schools as possible, maybe during Hispanic Heritage Month, who knows. So get it out there, get the story told. Why? Because I think it can be very inspirational. I know it very much inspired me as a young filmmaker. It still inspires me hearing Frank's story, hearing George's story, and I hope it also inspires other students. So the goal is to remaster it. So more like a 30-minute film, so that way you guys don't have to sit through it too long. So.
Okay, thank you for that. And Frank, I'd like to go back to you and ask the $34 million question. As someone who's an acute observer of the media, have things changed in the media with regards to how it portrays people of color mainly, but other folks as well, under the broad spectrum of diversity that we have today? Have things changed, do you believe, since 1983 when you did this?
Well, things have certainly changed. In terms of people themselves, we have some anchors and some editors, people that are very prominent in journalism who are Hispanic or people of color. So there's been some improvement on that, although still news staffs are predominantly white and more male than female. I'd like to see more diversity in that sense. In terms of coverage, of course, the news media is much different today than it was in 1983. Today we have kind of a multiplicity of outlets. Some of it on social media. Some stories are accurate. Some of the stories are partisan and inaccurate. But just looking at newspapers as a whole and the major TV networks, I would say that coverage has very much improved. I would rate it about a B at this point. Much, much better than 34 years ago.
Okay. And audience members, I don't see anybody lining up to ask questions. Nobody has any questions that they would like to ask these two professionals? You mean
Stories, I think he might mean.
you meant it was a 27-part series. Is that what you meant? Okay. Okay, Frank, the question was from the audience. What did the stories focus on? 27 parts. That's a lot of stories for a newspaper. I imagine you took over the newspaper for a few weeks with that number of stories.
Well, we took over part of the front page, that's for sure. Well, the stories range from stories about politics, stories about education, religion, labor in the job market. We had a wonderful story that kind of traced the history of Mexican Americans, immigrants from Mexico who had come to the U.S., done well in some cases, faced hardship in others. We also had stories, kind of first-person stories. A woman who's from Eloy, Arizona, had been a farm worker during the summer, and she went back to the fields of California. This was Virginia Escalante, and she profiled people working today in the fields, or working at that time in the fields, and she found that the conditions were still very, very harsh for people doing that type of work. George Ramos wrote a first-person story. I wrote about the kind of the diversity within the Hispanic community. So we had a great range of stories. We also covered the arts, literature, the visual arts, and pretty much covered most of the major subjects you would expect. We also did oral histories with 5 women that they told their stories in their own words. So those are some of the things that our series covered.
Okay. Do we have a question over there?
I have two.
Okay.
I want to ask you a question and the guy on the phone a question. And I'm short. There you go. Yeah. Obviously, there wasn't talent brought out for this. This was a documentary. How did you choose the LA Times? How did you choose the people that you chose? And then the question I'd like to ask the gentleman on the phone is, did he in his young life and ever have any aspirations of becoming who he is today? Thank you.
Very good.
Great questions, both. So once I learned about the first Hispanics to win a Pulitzer Prize, then I had to do a lot of work to actually, one thing for the filmmakers in the room and even media makers, one of the most important things in documentary is access. So you want to be able to access the interviewees that you want to get for your documentary. Or even if you're shooting a feature, access to some of those actors or producers. So Olga Briceño was in contact with Frank Sotomayor, who's always been a supporter from the start. So thank you, Frank, from the start of the documentary. He's always been very supportive of it. And Olga connected me with Frank, and as you'll know, when you start meeting people, one person leads you to the next, and then the next leads you to another two interviewees, and then those two interviewees lead you to the other 5 or 6. So it started that way, and I would say do your homework on whoever it is you're trying to appear in your documentary or even in your fiction film. Why? Because I think people appreciate you when you show that you've done your homework and you know their body of work, and you can very much relate to them in terms of some of the subject matter that they covered in their stories. So I was reading a lot as an undergrad. So then one thing I do recommend if you're planning to shoot a documentary is to do pre-interviews, to do phone interviews, much like having someone as distinguished as Frank on the line like we do now. Do the same thing. Give them a call on the phone, not text, not email. Pick up the phone and call them. And when you're on that phone with them, and I bring it up not just because of our current state in terms of technology and being glued to our phones, but I bring it up because you are able to get a sense of, will someone be a good interviewee? Could they potentially be dynamic on camera? Can they, do they have good stories to tell? So I actually spoke to the majority of the journalists on the series, and the people and the journalists you saw up on screen were those that I selected to interview. There's a reason why I flew out to New York and drove out to San Luis Obispo to interview George Ramos, to interview Robert Montemayor from the Wall Street Journal, because there were great subjects. So your documentary, think of it in a sense as a fiction film in terms of casting characters. So in a documentary, you're very much casting characters. So cast your characters wisely.
And what character did Frank Sotomayor play? No, I'm just kidding, Frank.
He was a hero.
Frank, you did seem, did you hear the question that she asked directed at you?
I believe I did. Well, as far as my own background, I grew up in a very poor section of Tucson, a section I call Barrio Hollywood. And my aspiration was to be an athlete. The only problem is I had very little athletic ability. So I wanted to be near sports, so I became a sports writer. And I never did dream that I would win a Pulitzer Prize. So this has been a tremendous honor. And I try to stay humble about it, that it was a team effort. It was something that happened at the right time, at the right place. And of course, very, very happy and proud that it did happen. And I congratulate Roberto on doing a great job of telling this story.
And
Thank you, Frank.
We didn't have time. I didn't want to read the bios of these two gentlemen word for word because they're extensive. But if you see the program, their bios are in there. And you will see that Frank has been a pioneer in so many organizations, a founder, an innovator, and throughout his career. So it seemed like this Pulitzer launched you, and maybe you were already launched by the time it came out, Frank. But could you tell us what your exact role was on the team? Were you the editor? Were you a reporter? Were you in the meetings when you had to go to bat to get this project done or get it nominated for a Pulitzer? Can you shed a little bit more light on the role you played on the team?
Well, I was one of the leaders of the series. George Ramos and I were the co-editors, which meant that we supervised the other reporters, the photographers. We did the editing of the stories. We were the ones that had to say, no, this isn't ready yet. You have to go back and rewrite. You have to go back and re-report. When it came time to try to get the project nominated for a Pulitzer, I'm one of the 3 people that met with the editor. In addition to that role as editor, I also wrote 3 stories for the series. So I was quite busy. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves. We worked very hard, and it was all worth it, of course.
Tell us a little bit about some of the pivotal moments in the project, whether it was arguing whether they should actually be done, or whether it was trying to make your case that it should be presented for a Pulitzer, it should be nominated for a Pulitzer. Tell us some of the pivotal moments as you look back on ensuring that it got published and it became what it has become.
Well, the first pivotal moment was at our first meeting, where we wanted to criticize, we wanted to kind of jump on the editors for the poor coverage. But we decided that instead of being negative, we would have a positive outlook to come with a set of story ideas.
And you were upset about the Marauder story in particular. That was really what set everybody off on the need for a series like this? It was the Marauder series, or was it others?
Well, the Marauder series was a very racist story about poor blacks and poor Latinos that were, the story said, that were robbing the affluent suburbs of Los Angeles and then rushing back on the freeways to their own communities. That certainly was motivated us to think more broadly about what coverage we wanted to do. But I think even if had the Marauders not happened, we would have come to the same conclusion that something had to be done to improve coverage. So that was an initial key point. Meeting with the editor for the first time was quite key also. We got a very positive response. When the first articles were ready and all the editors saw what we had to offer, then they were even more supportive. We started getting very positive feedback from the community. And finally, we had to meet 3 times with the editor to finally convince him that our story was worthy of a nomination. So all those were key points.
And meeting 3 times with a editor or publisher, I mean, I was in the industry, and meeting 1 time with the publisher and not getting a good response or getting a chilly response will quench your desire to meet with him or her again, but you went back 3 times. Tell us why.
Well, it took some guts. It took some guts because, as you say, we were told very clearly, no, we're not going to nominate your series. The editor says, yes, it was a good series, but it's not the type of story that wins a Pulitzer. So we were determined, because we represented the whole team. Even the editor initially had praised the series. So we reminded him of that and said that there is no limit as to the number of entries that you could put into the nomination. So he finally, I think he got tired of seeing us, and he finally says, okay, you write the nomination and I'll sign it, with very little expectation that the series would go anywhere.
And if I may jump in on something you said, Frank, in terms of coverage. So I think also the emerging Hispanic population in Southern California hadn't been reported on, and if it had been reported on, it was often as gang members, as undocumented immigrants, and I think, again, it's stories that we also see reflected in today's news. So very much what Frank and the rest of the team did was shed a new light on this emerging Hispanic population, and very much having it from a positive perspective, like Frank mentioned, writing about families, family values, writing about education, writing about Virginia Escalante's story, where she came from farm laborers. She grew up as a farm laborer herself in Eloy, Arizona, a couple of hours away from here. And she went on to the throes of success at the LA Times, winning a Pulitzer Prize. So Those types of stories were stories that were written about in the 27-part series, and they shed a new light on this population that was often referred to as gang members or undocumented immigrants.
Jonathan, I'd just like to say one more thing regarding diversity. When we were talking about diversity in the 1970s and the 1980s, the thought was primarily about race, about getting more blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans into the news media. But since that time, the concept of diversity has changed quite a bit. So today, diversity looks not only at race and ethnicity, but also gender, sexual orientation, class, age, religion, many other factors. So I really like the term, which I think is used there by an organization at Scottsdale College, inclusiveness. So we need to look at our communities, we need to look at our societies and see what people are being demonized or are being neglected, and to bring them into the spotlight of news coverage, and through the news coverage, bringing them more into the agenda of our daily life.
Okay, thank you. And we do have another question. Go ahead and give your name and tell us where you're from before you ask your question.
My name is Alex. I'm from Arizona.
Hi, Alex.
Hi. You showed like the statistics about how many people are still in the journalism industry at the end, and I feel like maybe those percentages probably haven't changed that much. I also know when I hear statistics that kind of represent myself, like when I hear about how many black people are in a certain industry or how many Latino people are in a certain industry and so on, I use that as a sort of, like, it's frustrating, but it's also really motivating because I feel like I'm going to be the one to make that change. So have you thought about using this and maybe future projects to inspire that kind of change?
And who is your question directed to? Both?
Oh, either one of you. But
Okay. Frank, did you get that question?
Oh, no, would you please repeat that, Jonathan?
Okay, I'll try and summarize it quickly.
The gist of the question? I did hear most of the conversation.
She saw the statistics at the end of the film that for 2007 that showed there hadn't been a lot of gains in representation in newsrooms by people of color, and she says she uses that as both motivation and a little bit of frustration as well to try and reverse that or do something about that. Did I characterize that right?
yeah.
Okay, and she wanted to know.
Are you planning on working on future projects that might do the same thing? So you specifically focused on like Latino people and Hispanic people, but I feel like there's so many more groups like Frank, right? Frank was talking about earlier. Like there are a bunch of other similar documentaries.
Right, she says there's still a lot of work to be done for a lot of different groups when it comes to media representation, and are you going to be involved in any? I can ask, both of you and Roberto can answer that.
Well, I would love to be involved. I still do some work in writing. However, I'm pretty much retired. I still do counseling and lecturing, and I'd be happy to come to Scottsdale College if we can work that out. But it's now up to a new generation of people. Roberto, people who are students now, people that are in the professions, and the general public to work and to demand a more diverse and inclusive news media so that we can hear stories from communities and populations that, as I said, now might be neglected or whose portrayal is very distorted. So this is a challenge for you, the new generation. I'm 74 years old now. I certainly plan to stay active as much as I can, but the work now is kind of taken on to a new generation. So this is a challenge to you.
Thank you, Frank. And before I let Roberto answer that question and wrap it up for us here, I just want to remind everybody that we will be down in the East Lobby here for a short meet and greet. If you have other questions you would like to ask Roberto or myself personally, if there's any food left, we'll set it out there as well. So, and with that, Roberto, why don't you answer this and end this program?
Sure, thank you. First of all, Alex, thank you for such a great question, and what a great way to wrap up the event. And I think, for me, this is an underdog story. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. And it was less about, I think it's important that we use our voices to tell our story. Be it if you're African American, if you're Hispanic American, that what this series did, the series that Frank and his team did, it lent a voice to this underrepresented community. And it could have been from any background. And I, myself, and the other filmmakers in the room, or other media makers, writers, photographers, journalists, use your voice to tell your stories. Use your voice, and I'm personally passionate about social justice. And that's very much what gravitated my interest to this film. And to answer your question, Alex, yeah, definitely there's projects I want to do out there that are not about Hispanics, that are of other minorities, other communities that don't have a voice. And I want to help provide a voice for those communities. And Alex, you're a media maker yourself? Yeah, go out there, write your stories or film your stories. For all you other filmmakers and media makers in the room as well, I encourage you to do the same. And especially with today's technology, there's so many different channels and platforms. YouTube, you could get millions of viewers to help tell your story. There's Facebook, social media, the democratization, that's my GRE word of the day, by the way. The democratization of media is great. You could go out there and buy a DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera, for about $500. It shoots HD, higher quality, higher resolution than the images up here. So you could go out there, grab a camera. We have cameras in the cage at the Scottsdale School of Film and Theater, at the Film School Hub. It's right here on campus, guys, on the northeast side of campus. Go there, register, and take a class. You could use equipment that cost over $1 million and start shooting your film, Alex. Start shooting your film, Trinity. Who else do I see in the room that's my student? Lynn, of course. Lynn from El Salvador. Welcome back. Oh, Dominican Republic. Man, I was doing well until I mentioned that. El Salvador, I know. But yeah, I encourage, there's so many opportunities to let your voice be heard. Take the opportunity, run with it. Not having money is no longer an excuse. Not having the equipment is no longer an excuse. Tell your story, put it out there, and let your voice be heard.
And with that, I would like to thank Frank for being with us and Roberto for being with us. Can we give them both a big hand? Thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. And if you choose to, please join us in the East Lobby. Thank you for coming.
Can I ask a question?
Oh.
Sorry.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to know, because it was pretty disappointing finding out that the journalists in the documentary didn't receive the recognition and honor they had expected and clearly deserved. So, since then, did they ever, particularly from the LA Times, did they receive the recognition they had hoped for?
Frank, are you still with us? Are you referring to, some of them did get a lot of recognition.
Okay.
But there were several that kind of didn't quite reach the level that the other ones made. So you're asking if mostly everyone reached the recognition and support they deserve for working on this project. Frank, did you hear that?
I did hear some of it, but is the question about whether individuals gained recognition through the project?
Yes. Has everyone gained the recognition they deserved for working on this project? that correct?
Well, I'm not sure about that. Different people had different sense about that. Virginia Escalante felt that she was not respected for what she had done, and she left the newspaper after several years afterwards, so she was not happy. None of us was promoted outright, and that was kind of a sore spot. But overall, I think I was treated well. Others felt they were treated well. Roberto Montemayor felt that he was not respected, and he didn't feel that there was a good path for him. So he went to business school and worked on the business side of the news media. So it varied from person to person. Overall, I think the Pulitzer and the series were a very positive part of our journalism careers and our progression to journalism.
Again, I want to thank you for being a pioneer in this industry and for all your contributions that you've made to journalism, to America, really, in telling our story, telling the full and complete story. So thank you very much. And with that, we'll end it.